Hello and welcome to another session of this course Marketing Management Part 1, third volume, third module of this course, that is capturing market insights, and we are in the second week of discussion into this capturing market insight. So, in the last class we have started talking about causal research design. Before that we have looked into the different stages of the marketing research process, and then we started talking about the different types of research design. So, yesterday we talked about the causal research design, that is experimental design, and today I am going to talk about measurement and scaling, which is part of to both of these conclusive research design, that is descriptive as well as causal research design, that how do you basically measure the variables. So, a brief introduction to measurement. Measurement is the way of describing some property of a phenomena of interest, usually by assigning numbers or symbol in a reliable and a valid way. So, what is measurement? Measurement is a process wherein we try to assign an object or entity a symbol or number based on some pre-decided. This should be done in a reliable and a valid way. So, now understand, these numbers are the symbols which have been assigned to an object or entity. They basically convey the information about the property being measured. When numbers are used, the researchers must have a priori rule for assigning a number to an observation in a way that provides an accurate description. So, the idea is that you should have a pre-decided rule for assigning the numbers or symbols to any object. There are some basic rules in the measurement, that is correspondence rule, that one to one correspondence between the number and the characteristics being measured, that you cannot assign two levels of symbol, you cannot decide two numbers to one object or entities. It will, one object will have, based on its property, it will have a particular number or a particular object. So, there has to be one to one correspondence, and the rule for assigning number should be standardized and applied uniformly. So, the basic rule is that the way in which you assign the numbers to an object based on its property, it should be standardized, it should be decided a priori, and it should be applied uniformly. And one more thing which is very important is that these rules of assignment should not change over the time, over the period of time. So, what do we measure actually? In marketing, we basically measure things which are called as constructs, or and they are basically somewhat different from what we study in some other fields. So, take the example like medical sector is variables like body weight, or probably the in some in automobile, in the case of automobile we study the speed or the velocity. So, all those things are something which is directly observable. However, the kind of concept that we study in the case of marketing research, they are somewhat different. Like we study concept like customer satisfaction. So, how do you measure a customer satisfaction? You will see that customer satisfaction cannot be, it is not something a directly observable phenomena. However, you can study or you can measure this concept of customer satisfaction by understanding the state of that customer satisfaction, and being in that state, and a customer will exhibit certain kind of properties. So, by basically measuring those things, you can understand the state of or the level of the customer satisfactions. The thing which we call them these concept as that we study in the marketing is constructs, and these constructs are often not manifest or readily observable, meaning we cannot see or touch many of the phenomena that we are interested in. Therefore, we use multiple item scales or a set of manifest observation to measure latent constructs. So, the concept that we test in the marketing is, or we measure in the marketing research is generally are latent construct. There is a thing called operationalization. You will see that you can have a certain definition of the customer satisfaction, but to measure that customer satisfaction you need to have its operational definition, or you need to operationalize that construct, in the sense you have to develop indicators or items for measuring the construct. As I have already told that, as in the concept of customer satisfaction, when a customer is satisfied, it will exhibit, it will indicate certain kind of properties. There could be a variation depending on the level of the customer satisfaction among these indicators, but they will do, they will certainly exhibit certain kind of properties. So, if you can basically measure, or if you can understand those indicators and measure those indicators, you can understand that construct or the concept. Now, what is scaling actually? Scaling is a device providing a range of values that correspond to different values in a concept being measured. Involves creating a continuum upon which measured observed are located, and you will see that I will tell you, you must have come across some kind of survey where you might have seen this kind of scales being used, that attitude scale or attitude towards a particular object, and you have been asked to rate that or you provide your attitude on a scale of 1 to 11, where 1 represent an extremely unfavorable attitude and 11 represent the extremely favorable. Measurement is actual assignment of a number from 1 to 11 to each respondent. So, depending on basically what kind of property or what level of that property object entails inside it, depending on that property you basically assign a number to that object. The scaling is the process of placing the respondent on a continuum with respect to their attitude towards department store, as in this case, this example, that you are measuring the attitude towards a department scale, whether it is highly favorable or extremely unfavorable or extremely favorable. Based on that, you have to put that respondent on a scale of 1 to 11, and then you can assign a number to that respondent. So, there are basically 4 types of scales that are used in the marketing research. The first one is basically the nominal scale. I will explain each of these 4 types of scales through a one example, which will tell you within one example the different type of scale and what is the difference among these scales, you can understand from there. So, nominal scale is the one which is the most basic type of scaling. Here labels or tags are used for identifying and classifying objects. So, you just assign some symbols or numbers to objects to identify them. However, they do not reflect the amount of characteristics possessed. So, one example of this nominal scale is your registration number in this course. So, registration number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or probably 5625 people in this course who are registered for this course. So, you will see that each one of you have a registration number. So, that is basically a nominal scale. However, you will understand in this nominal scale, the registration number 1, the student who have been assigned the registration number 1 does not exhibit or does not say anything beyond that he is one of the participant of this course. He is no better than a person who has been assigned a registration number of 5625. So, you can understand based on these things, there are a very limited option in terms of the statistical operations that can be applied, and you can only basically perform percentage and mode analysis on these scales. The second type of scale is basically ordinal scale. Ordinal scale indicate the relative position of objects, but not the magnitude of difference. So, in this class, in this registration class of 5625, you will see that you got a rank in you got a grade on your assignment. You will see that all those who are basically have been graded A are better than those who have been assigned grade B. but and those who have been assigned B are probably better than C, but you cannot say how much better basically A is from the B. It could be very marginal and it could be probably on a higher side, the difference could be on the higher side. At the same time, you can also cannot understand, or you cannot infer that the difference between the category and A and B is same as the difference between B and C. So, that kind of a difference is not possible. The comparison of the magnitude of difference is not possible. The commonly applied operations is that you can perform percentile, median, rank order correlation and ANOVA on this ordinal scales. Then you have the third type of scaling is that interval scale. These are the most commonly used type of scales in the marketing. The differences in the interval scale, the differences between objects can be compared, that you can compare between two categories, the difference between two objects. However, the 0 is not 0 is arbitrarily assigned. So, it is just a sort of arbitrary assignment of 0, and what you can perform on this interval scale is that you can perform a range of statistical operation like a range, mean, standard deviation, and you can do this correlation, t-test and regression using these interval scales. The last type of scale is the ratio scale. Compared to the interval scale, even the 0 is fixed. So, these are basically you can say that absolute values and ratios of scale values can be compared. I will explain to you this all these 4 different types of scales are through an example, and that will give you a better clarity about it. But you will see on the ratio scale you can also perform geometric mean or harmonic mean, and you can perform this coefficient of variation kind of analysis using the ratio scale. So, here I have an example about a class where there are 5 students, and through this class example I can explain to you all the 4 different types of scales. Now, as I have already told that in this class supposedly there are 5 students. So, each one of them has been assigned a specific or a registration number. You will see that that is what the correspondence rule was, that one student cannot be assigned 2 registration number. Each of these student has been assigned a unique registration number, and this registration number 1 to 5 is a basically type of nominal scale, where these are just symbols to understand who is, I mean by calling the registration number I can understand who is the student. So, it is a sort of identification, however, it does not tell anything about the student, that the student A is the student number with registration number 1 is better than the student registration number 5. Now, there is another basically data in this class is that what is your class rank, your overall class rank with based on your overall evaluation in this class. So, there might be multiple ways in this on which this I might have reached on this class ranking, and in this class ranking one of the criteria is that your level of participation, your marks in the final written exam, and there could be some other evaluation criteria, and that constitute to your overall evaluation, and based on that I have come across the rank. So, student 1 has got the 3rd rank in this class, student with registration 2nd student has got the class rank 1. So, he is the topper of the class. The 3rd student is having lowest rank in the class, that is 5th. The 4th student has 4th rank in the class, and the student 5th has having a class rank of 2nd. Now, you see that here you can say that student 1 has a better academic potential, or he has performed better than the others in the class. You can compare. Here you cannot say that this student with registration number 2, based on his class rank you can say that he is better than the rest of the student. However, based on his registration number you cannot say, or you cannot make any such conclusions. The third basically data from this class is level of class participation. So, this is a basically a data about you can assume it is a classroom setting kind of evaluation of the class, where probably unlike this kind of mode of discussion where I am delivering the lectures through this recording mode and you are watching on your convenient time and place. So, where the one to one or face to face interaction is not possible. However, in the class discussion, this is one of the important component of the evaluation, where instructor basically assesses what is basically the level of participation of a particular student on a scale of 1 to 5, that is interval scale, whether and now you will see that this level of class participation has 5 different categories, starting from very low to average, high and very high. So, now you see that a student with registration number 1 has a very high class participation, or is having a high class participation, and student 2 is having an average class participation, student 3 is very low class participation, student 4 is basically having a low class participation, and then student 5 is having a very high class participation. So, you can see that it is a basically interval scale, and then the last is basically the ratio scale, where this is a basically an objective type exam of 100 marks, where in this exam they have scored out of 100. So, you can see that student 1 has got 60 marks, student 2 has got 95 marks, and these are basically the absolute marks. You can see that you can clearly understand what is 0. 0 means in this case is that student has not done has not answered any questions correctly. From there you can understand that that this student 2 has done probably the best in the class, and then you have this student 5, and you can understand that you can clearly understand the difference among the student here. So, these are the 4 different types of the scales being used in the marketing research. These scales are basically how do you measure using these scales a particular concept or construct is of 2 types. The most common types of scale used in the marketing are non-comparative scale, where each item or each property is being measured independently, each property of an object is measured independent of the other objects or other properties. Scales which are there in this non-comparative scale, that is continuous rating scales and the itemized rating scale. Most commonly we use itemized rating scales. In the continuous scale, it is a continuous scale, as I was showing that you have a continuum of particular lower point to the higher point, and the respondent or the object being measured is placed on a particular point in this between 2 different extremes of this scales. In the itemized rating scale, you have different categories of object. So, where what happens, a number or a brief description is associated with each category. I will explain to you through an example what this itemized scale is. Ordered categories in terms of scale positions to select the specified categories that best describes the objects being rated, and the commonly used itemized scales are generally the Likert type scale, semantic, differential scale. So, you will see that that to capture the property of an object, the level of a property that is inherent in an object, you create certain categories. So, you basically a sort of intervals within which a property lies, and across these different categories you compare or you basically assess as a respondent what is the level of that property in that object, and depending on your assessment you place that you put your rating on across these different categories. So, depending on which category he falls, you say that he is part of this category. So, there are different types of scaling which are possible. This is dichotomous scale, like where you have two types of responses, that yes or no, or could be any other thing, that have you filled your income tax return for the year 2014-15, and it can be answered in yes or no. Then you have multiple choice type of questions, like you have gone out for dinners with here you can see you can answer more than one, you can check more than one box whether you have gone along with your spouse or your children, spouse and children, and your friends, your business associates. Now, I was talking about itemized rating scales. Now, you see one item of rating is sort of this thing which is called as Likert scale, that I ask you a question or you are being asked at the end of the course that I think marketing management 1 is a must course for managers. Now, you have basically categories, you try to focus here, that you are asked a questions that to what extent you believe that marketing management is a course for all managers. The basically the response that could be under different categories, and these categories are like strongly disagree, disagree, neither agree nor disagree, agree and strongly agree. So, that these are the different categories under which the responses can be captured. You see that here you do not have, you cannot assign an absolute value to this, to your assessment of how much you recommend this course to a particular manager, but you can certainly basically assess what is probably the degree or what is the level of suitability of this course for the manager, or what is essential, what is probably the level or to what extent this course can be helpful to them. Then you have another type of scale which is a semantic differential scale, where you have extreme or opposite wordings on the scale, that that if I ask you how will you rate Indigo's in-flight service, or if I ask you how much important probably to you is a particular kind of in-flight service. So, your answer could be basically on a this kind of a scale, that whether you rate Indigo service from worst to probably a best based on your experiences and your assessment. You will see that the end points or the extreme points are diametrically opposite in terms of their wordings. While we are making these scales, while we are constructing these scales to for the measurement of a particular property, what we need to understand is that we should ensure the reliability and the validity of a the scale, and you will see that reliability refers to the extent to which a scale produces consistent results if repeated measurements are made. If a scale is reliable and if it is used repetitively, it will generate similar kind of same results. And then validity is of a test concern, what the test measures and how well it does so. So, validity is about what you are trying to measure, and you are measuring the same thing what you are trying to measure. I will explain to you this concept of reliability and validity through an example. Suppose there is a weighing scale and you are trying to measure your weight, and from some other weighing scale which was working fine, you know that you weigh 65 kg. Now, when you measure it on this new weighing scale, and you find that your weight comes out to be 67.5. However, if your weight comes every time as 67.5, then you will understand that this is basically a reliable measure, but it is not a valid measure, because it is not measuring what it is supposed to measure, that is 65 kg. However, it is reliable because it is measuring the same, it is giving you the same measurement every time. So, there is no random error basically involved in this measurement. However, if the scale, the new scale also measures your weight as a 65 kg, then basically it is reliable as well as valid also, because it is giving you the same reading every time when you are weighing, that is 65, and your actual weight is 65 and the measured weight is 65, that means it is valid also. So, with this I finish off this topic of measurement and scaling today, and we will talk about a new topic in the next class onwards. Thank you very much.